Hi, this is Hannah, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast. You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects. In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analytics to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world. Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago.
How do war and conflict give rise to gender-based violence? In this episode, we speak with Dr. Maliha Chishti, an assistant instructional professor at the Divinity School and an associate of the Pearson Institute. Her core research interests are international peacebuilding, security, and development, as well as gender and human rights in post-conflict contexts. We talk about gender-based violence in the context of war, Dr. Chishti's work in passing Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and the complexities of humanitarian aid implementation today.
Hi, my name is Hannah Balikci. I'm a second-year MPP student at the Pearson School.
Hi there, my name is Higgins. I'm a second-year student at Harris School and at Pearson College.
Hi, my name is Rabail, Sofi. I'm a second-year student at
I wanted to thank Dr. Maliha Chishti for joining us today in studio. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
We wanted to start off the conversation by asking you to introduce yourself and your work.
Sure. Yes, I'm assistant instructional professor here at the Harris School of Public Policy, but I'm also joint faculty at the Divinity School. And my field of research is the intersections of religion, culture, gender, and politics, specifically addressing issues of women in war-affected regions with a specialization in Afghanistan.
Great. I think we'll have an amazing opportunity to get into some of those topics today. I think a good place to start off would be, your previous work and how maybe they relate to the current moment and various situations unfolding across the globe. So we know that your doctoral thesis focused on conflict analysis and post-colonial critique in Afghanistan. And according to our research, you argue that the U.S.'s intervention constructed, quote, an outwardly oriented state responsive to the desires and needs of the international community, rather than being inwardly oriented and responsive to the needs, expectations, and lived realities of the majority of Afghans. So we're curious, as a researcher, do you observe any parallels between this analysis and how scholars will characterize U.S. support and funding of conflicts that are still ongoing?
Well, you really did your homework. I haven't looked at dissertation in a while. Well, my work really merges two ideas together, ideas that come out of academic research, and also ideas that circulate in the practitioner community. So I am an academic practitioner or a scholar activist, and half of my life has been to try and understand how foreign aid operates in war-affected countries or it operates in third world countries, and then to try and extrapolate that in the field of theory, critical theory, post-colonial analysis, and development thought and development thinking, to merge those ideas together. And the dissertation was a launching pad for me to do that. And then as I was thinking through the impact of war on women, for example, in Afghanistan, you see the same kind of trends happening across the war on terror in other sort of war hotspots. And so my work has been to sort of see these intersections of empire and how empire is connected to foreign aid and how that intervenes and gets resisted, gets reconfigured and remapped by communities. So the best case is Afghan women. And so my research has, from that dissertation, has moved on to a very specific focus on the impact of, war on Afghan women and the global war on terror specifically, which has been an outstanding failure. And what I was writing about 10 years ago, it's almost haunting, because when I was defending that dissertation, there was a lot of hope in the air that the goals and the intentions of the war on terror were operating, were happening, were unfolding. But as we found out for 20 years, much of what was happening we didn't know about. The Washington Post published a series of interviews, 600 interviews, called the Afghanistan Papers, that have been declassified. They were interviews with high-ranking U.S. government officials at the State Department, the DoD, international agencies, including Afghans. And essentially, the headline, if you were to summarize the headline of the Afghanistan, was to clearly call out colossal strategic failure of the war on terror in Afghanistan, and that how most Americans and Canadians, because I'm a Canadian, didn't know. We were sort of shielded from the magnitude of that failure. So we kept supporting it, and that support sort of ebbed and flowed, but nevertheless, we're here with the Brown University's Cost of War project, a report that was just published that puts a dollar amount on that failure, and that's $8 trillion with close to 1 million deaths. Deaths of who? Deaths of civilians and combatants, as well as journalists and humanitarian workers. And so we're sort of sitting here and having to come to grips with that, or perhaps we've moved on.
Right. And I think that quantification aspect is something that we are always sort of keeping in context here at the Harris School. Really interesting to hear about that new research. I think also, to continue on this vein, we're curious, have you observed a shift in people's understanding of the US's definition of the war on terror since we pulled out of Afghanistan, and how do you characterize that now?
Right. I think that the war on terror has always been this phantom. It's ambiguous. It's never quite solidified. The terrorist is this elusive figure that comes in and out, and it's very much trope that is given to sort of a singular entity, and that would be Muslim. It doesn't matter if somebody else commits those same acts of terror in other countries that are racialized differently, etc. The label of terrorist has been targeted almost very specifically to Muslims. And so I think that trope remains, and it's useful to have, I think, because it's easy to embark on it and then validate and mobilize a war machine to go after it. And so now, for those academic scholars, activists, organizations that are starting to come to grips with what the war on terror is, especially as we receive these kinds of reports that are coming out of Brown's University that call it colossal failure, then hoping that mainstream Americans and Westerners can start to critically interrogate it, and to critically interrogate the underlying assumptions, biases, and ideas that are associated with them. It's not to say that the entirety of the war on terror is false. It's not. But it's to say that we have a lot of critical work to do, as academics, as activists, as citizens, to find out, what really is at the core. That's a conversation that I don't think happens.
Incredibly helpful analysis for us. And now I think we'd like to switch gears just a little bit to transition into a discussion about gender-based violence in the context of war overall. I'll start us off with maybe a question about the gendered media framing that happens a lot of the times in the context of civilian deaths. So many news outlets seem to apply what we see as an inherently gendered lens in their reporting. So, for instance, commonly cited refrain in recent headlines is that to date, 2/3 of those killed in Gaza are women or children. And, on one hand, this is a factual demographic statement that deserves acknowledgement. But on the other hand, it may portray female agency in a way that is less than optimal. So can you walk us through what you think about the utility of this type of media framing?
Sure. So maybe we can sort of step back a little bit and talk about women, peace, and security. So women, peace, and security is a framework that engages women's organizations on the ground, international organizations, the UN, states, researchers, etc. The core underlying idea, WPS, is that women are disproportionately impacted by war and protracted conflicts. Since, I think, the 20th century, women and children and the elderly are disproportionately killed in wars. And so the context that's happening in Gaza and reporting that over 2/3 are women, that's not new for those of us who research the impact of war on women. Now, I think sort of given that idea of the Security Council Resolution 1325, which very specifically underpins the Women, Peace and Security framework, that Security Council is historic because it's the first time that the UN took women seriously, frankly, and understood that there is a disproportionate impact of war on women. And because it kind of creates the overarching framework, that piece of resolution, I think, is very important. I helped to draft that resolution, I helped to conceptualize that resolution, and I helped to push it through at the UN. Part of the significance of that resolution is to recognize that women are killed and that they are victims. So, one, that they are victims, but second, they have agency, meaning that they are at the forefront in every war context since the 1990s that we have recorded that are promoting peace, that are crossing ideological, religious, tribal, whatever boundaries of difference, protracted difference. Women have been sort of peacemakers, peace negotiators, bringing communities together, but their sort of roles are seldom formalized, meaning they're never really sitting at peace negotiation tables. Their voices are muted in international processes of peace negotiation, and Security Council 1325 acknowledges that and their important role in rebuilding countries, so peace building and post-conflict recovery. Back to that question, I have found it troubling how, despite we're in an age of social media, the narratives of what's happening in Gaza with women aren't coming from women in Gaza. And if they're coming, they are incredibly held in suspect. They're suspicious. They're like, well, I'm not quite sure if that's what all women are actually experiencing: death, displacement, hunger. And so you have an interesting sort of situation that unfolds, that establishment and those in the hierarchy of power at the top mediate voices and start to sift through them. They're not talking to AP, they're not talking to Al Jazeera, they're not talking to CNN. They're talking to local women's organizations. They're talking to sort of local networks, and they are sort of mobilizing and engaging in advocacy work for themselves. But we are not really hearing it, or if we're hearing it, we're not prioritizing it. And that's the tragedy, is to look at the mechanisms of power that are in place that mute, silence, and marginalize these very critical voices.
Just one thing to go back on. Would you mind just explaining or talking about Security Resolution 1325 and some of the main points and what it's done and since it's been enacted, just sort of for our audience that may not know?
Sure. So Security Council Resolution 1325 it's considered a landmark resolution. As I mentioned, first time the United Nations Security Council addresses women as part of their mandate, which is to promote international peace and security. The resolution 1325 has three core frameworks. One is the protection of women in armed conflict. The second is the analysis and the understanding that women should be at the peace table. So they should be negotiating peace settlements. And the third, that women are active participants in the recovery of their societies. So their critical role in peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. So that particular resolution has subsequently created a bunch of new resolutions on the block, so to speak, and they're addressing sort of very different issues. Now, this resolution is important because it's coming out of women's voices and women's organizations for decades. So, the United Nations Conference on Women held these caucuses of women in armed conflict, And herein you had women from around the world for the first time gathering every 10 years and documenting what they were experiencing in wars. And the international women's movement, academics, etc., started to take notice of that because the armed conflict caucuses at the women's conference were flooding with, they were just very engaged, dynamic, really. And so, everybody was trying to figure out what was going on. And we noticed that what women were enduring, we had very little idea about. And that so this was coming from the global south, saying that these wars, over 114 in the 1990s, Rwanda, Bosnia, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Liberia, etc., these women were gathered together and they were looking at how their impact of their particular war was the same in so many ways. And the international women's movement documented those experiences. And the specific attention was sexual violence, that women were used as weapons of war. Their bodies were foils of war. Their bodies, their honor was a weapon of war used to manipulate war. And so from that conversation, including 1325, was the first time that the international community recognized rape as a weapon of war and rape as a war crime.
I know you just mentioned sexual violence in war, and that's actually one of the sections that we're interested in learning more about. Because right now we are seeing a lot of sexual violence in conflict zones across the world. We know that the use of sexual torture against Palestinians specifically, since that's really trending right now, is extensively documented since 1948, whether it's in Israeli prisons or during the midnight raids that are going on, or just at checkpoints in general. We see that these are sexual violence structures of militarization. And taking this next question away from Gaza and what's happening in Palestine, could you dive a little more deeper into how war gives rise to sexual and gender-based violence?
So violence against women and sexual violence against women particularly is one act of ethnic cleansing because it targets women's bodies as holding national honor for their ethnicity, their state, their people. And so by dishonoring women, you dishonor the nation and you virtually collapse society. And so there's a lot that's been written about it in the context of Rwanda and Bosnia. In fact, what has been so courageous in world history is the testimonies that came out of Bosnia and the massive sexual assaults and rapes. And the testimonies given by those women for the international community to hear and to prosecute and recognize rape as a war crime. So that's really sort of imperative that we sort of understand that it's just not women alone, but that the idea is intentional. It is intentional in the context of those that seek to pursue policies of ethnic cleansing. And they will target women. In fact, to kill women, to target women, to rape women, to impregnate women, to forcefully transmit AIDS to women. These are all sort of documented across the wars and that they happen regularly. And now there's a lot of international attention to it. What I think I really want to say is that we're in a very difficult situation right now where we're clawing back from positioning the centrality of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, Geneva Conventions, Rome statutes. So we collectively experienced in the 1990s wars I was mentioning is a new, actually post-World War II, international apparatus of human rights, humanitarian law. And we had, a lot of formidable sort of new institutions in place, like the International Criminal Court, for example. When we willfully do not recognize violations of international humanitarian law, when we see genocide and don't call it genocide, when we see rape as a crime, as a weapon of war, and we don't call it out, when we see the indiscriminate killing of civilians, and we don't call it out in the language of international law, but we politicize it or provincialize it or even sort of ghettoize it as a foreign policy issue of another state, then we essentially crumble the very foundations that we've worked so hard to build up. And then calling out human rights violations in the world becomes hypocritical. And and here's what I'm going to say is what we do when we don't call it out is we practice Western. If we don't apply the very laws that we have created in terms of a civilized society that is bounded by law, I mean, that's the whole Western post-Enlightenment project, isn't it? So when we see it, don't call it, then what are we saying? Either we're saying that the entire international apparatus of humanitarian law, human rights, isn't really real. We don't really want to put too much into it. Or we're saying that Palestinians are subhuman. They're not full human beings. Their full personhood doesn't count. And so it's okay to not apply international law to them. And then when you say that, I don't know, you don't say that out loud, but when you don't have uniformity, especially at the level of the United States foreign policy and statements coming out of the White House calling it a genocide. I mean, if it looks like a genocide, talks like a genocide, it's a genocide. And it's not a genocide because out of moral outrage. It's a genocide because a genocide has a legal definition. That legal definition has been met. And South Africa has compiled 84 pages outlining what that genocide is, evidence-based, and has taken it to the International Criminal Court. And we know that, I mean, you look through that document, it's written by lawyers. Many international humanitarian lawyers, many lawyers have already called it out. So for us to be in a context here, the year 2024, where the White House is very reticent about calling it the G word, then we're in hot trouble. We're in hot trouble in the context of how we have become complete warmongering instead of promoting peace. And the fact that we're hesitant to call for a ceasefire, that calling for a ceasefire is becoming politicized, we're in hot waters. And I'm really nervous about what kind of messaging we're sending to the rest of the world coming out of the United States. That messaging is terrifying because we have just folded our tents, gone home, and likely will the charges against us as being biased, of being lawless, are rightly to be considered.
Thank you so much for mentioning international law, giving that context. I think it's super helpful for our audience. Kind of going back to what you said about testimonials, bringing up Bosnia, Rwanda, we are seeing a lot of very violent forms of violence, sexual violence specifically, whether it's leaked or just shared. We're of course seeing this in Palestine. We saw this happening in Iraq. We also saw a lot of stuff leaked from Afghanistan. What are your thoughts on the lack of coverage of sexual violence perpetrated by?
Sure, it's the lack of coverage in mainstream media.
Yes.
But it's solid coverage in social media and alternative media and in the media outlets of the non-Western world. And so that to me is a very striking look at what is going on and how our media communications, at least formally, institutionally, is implicated in war machinery. And so and I think the average person knows that. Right? I mean, I'm probably a rare breed. I'm not on TikTok. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on whatever else there is. So I am not, but I am close to other people who sort of have these perspectives and whose perspectives have changed, who have a sense of what's happening in the world because mainstream media is biased, right? And for those who study media politics, media communications, we Noam Chomsky 101, right? So we know manufactured consent, manufactured sort of media. and how media is very closely related to government. So that's fine. I think that the fact that people and people grouped in social movements are aware and circulate these testimonies, who believe these testimonies, that's what's really important, is that when they see women in Gaza, they don't stop and say, oh, who is she? And maybe she's faking her tears. And so, whereas in the vetting, looking at these images and immediately holding them, suspect, that doesn't happen in social media. It's actually quite democratized. So we have much more real dialogue debate that happens on these alternative media platforms than we do on by institutional media. And so I don't actually even think of mainstream media as a source of credible information anymore. I don't even want to be validated in those outlets. I don't, and I don't think that I'm alone. I think that we're now increasingly looking at alternative media podcasts, right? I watch a lot of YouTube podcasts, and what's happening is that it's interesting because the people that are in these alternative media podcasts, they're the ones that are doing such interesting work. They would never be given a guest spot on CNN or Fox News, etc. So in that sense, I think that as much as it's shut down in mainstream media, it's not in global media. And I think it's very important for us here in the United States to start to peer into what news outlets are saying in other parts of the world. Like, go on to the news sites. I actually read newspapers in Afghanistan. Phenomenal news, right? Like they write about what's happening in their country that you can't get a hold of here, because it's never interesting. It never makes the cut. You can find out what's happening in Palestine by engaging in news outlets in Jordan, in Egypt, and many of them are circulating in English. And so we do have spots of credible news stories and these atrocities being understood, validated, and circulated.
Thank you. I think one of the things that we wanted to ask you was just related to that. What sort of people and or news outlets would you recommend if people want to get more news directly from, as you say, like Egypt or Jordan? Is there anything that comes to mind? Or I think the direct news, I also find that, and especially reading the news in the language is really a helpful way, which not everybody can do, but now there's so many translation services that people could use. Is there a way that we could uplift voices directly from these places of war, or that like any sort of, are there specific organizations and or media sources that you think are doing good work in terms of uplifting these voices in a way that isn't making it to mainstream media? And how does the democratization of media in terms of social media either enhance or detract from uplifting these voices?
Sure. So, I mean, in the context of women's voices, I would suggest that people look into local women's organizations. And every major women's organization across the world has some kind of a website or some kind of a platform where they circulate ideas. Like, for example, in Afghanistan, RAWA, which is Revolutionary Association of Women in Afghanistan. It's the largest national secular organization in the country. It repeatedly posts these really impressive press releases that nobody but me reads, but right? Like nobody reads in the West. And I always look at the analysis and I find it so engaging and so refreshing. And I think when we decenter the analysis from, Western outlets, and we earnestly look to see what the majority of the world is thinking about it, then we'll be intrigued, and we can have, engaging analysis, and you can really help to have, a more comprehensive understanding. So looking at women's organizations, and you can just do, basic Google searches for local women's organizations and go navigate on their websites. You can do that with local headlines in different countries. They all pop up. It's really easy to get that information if you're interested in it and you're interested in reading about it. And also, I would say to read authors that are, based in those countries. if you're interested in feminist writings, for example, I read their works, their understanding, their analysis. And what that tells us is it almost opens the world's what the real perspective is on issues, that it's just not us in our little silo conversations. We're just talking amongst ourselves. But when you kind of have a conversation, and by conversation, I mean when you hook into these perspectives from around the world, you get a really good sense. They're just enriching and they're important to read. And I'll give you an example. You've had Professor Amal Hamada on, right?
Yeah.
She is so brilliant. I had a meeting with her. We both teach the same course. I teach Women, Peace, and Security here at the University of Chicago. She teaches a similar course on gender and security at the University of Cairo. And we were talking about 1325. And I just started talking about, my students engage with 1325 in this way and that way. And do you know what she said about Egyptian women in her classes? They said, we don't care about it. And I was kind of like held back by it. Like, what? It's such an important landmark resolution. And she said, no, they don't care because they say that the Western world infringes on human rights, international law, on all of these resolutions. They themselves push them through and are the first to walk away. So why should we even think about it? Why do we have to frame our conversation as Arab women on the context of a Western instrument that is flagrantly violated at every point by those same powers that push it through and promote it? And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And wouldn't it be interesting if our students got together and had a conversation about it? So that is, imagine how enriching that is for us to get a sense of how other people perceive what we value. Where I'm thinking the only pathway out of this situation is international humanitarian law. There's a pushback from a group of Egyptian women at a university that's like, no, that's not our only pathway. And so I'm intrigued. Well, what's your pathway? How do we get out of this mess? And they might have something very intriguing to say.
Yeah, absolutely. She was our last guest on the podcast, so when looking at these questions similarly, noticing a similar pattern in terms of the work that we would be talking about. And one similar something on the same lines as Dr. Hamada's work is, how do gender dynamics, cultural norms, and societal expectations shape the experiences and roles of women in longstanding conflict, whether that's Palestine, Afghanistan, sort of global?
Sure. I mean, I think in the context of conflict, there are multiple competing roles that women take on. We know that. We know that most women become female-headed households overnight, right? I mean, 10,000 children in Gaza have no fathers right now since October 7th. That number has increased, but the last time UN Women reported it. And so that thrusts women into roles of mothers and fathers as providers and managing resources and maneuvering already shortages of humanitarian aid, taking on the toll of displacement. What does displacement do? 82% of people in Gaza right now, I mean, just one conflict that's right in front of us, these families are displaced, and women are at the forefront of having to take on multiple roles just for survival. So the survival, the resilience, and taking on multiple roles, and also claiming victimhood too. I mean, that's a profound role to be in, where you are yourself a victim, but you have no choice but to be resilient and strong and be an income provider or, a primary caregiver for, the most vulnerable and the weakest in your household.
Yeah, I mean, just related to migration, according to UN Women, the conflict in Gaza has resulted in close to 493,000 women and girls being displaced from their homes. And related to that, how can we begin to think about the generational ripple effects of forced migration on women and girls in the generations to come?
The trauma that is happening and the implications of that trauma. I mean, there's been such important documentaries actually that came out of Palestine over sort of the last wars in Gaza. 2014 I'm thinking about, and I saw a really interesting film, short film documentary, a young woman who every day woke up in terror because of the bombs that she experienced and the deaths that were happening around her in 2014. And this was years later. So imagine that one documentary was just tracking the life of one woman, and you compound that with a population of 2 million. And what are the implications of that trauma? How does that trauma implicate and impact women in their everyday roles? I mean, dreams that were squashed, right? Lives that were killed, identities that were dismantled, and sort of like a quandary. How does a population in such a confined area then rebuild, restore, recover? Those are, I mean, there are people that specialize in that. I certainly don't know, but I can imagine that we're so caught in the conflict right now, but implications and the reverberations of this conflict are many years going to be unfolding very specific lives of children, women, and men.
Right. And just continuing that thread and maybe continuing on specifically, using Gaza as a case study since we've gotten into it a bit. We've seen that each day there are 180 women approximately giving birth without water, painkillers, anesthesia for C-sections, electricity, medical supplies. We also know that mothers have been reported to mix baby formula with contaminated water and to go without food for days on end so that their children can eat. And so situations like this really necessitate a need for humanitarian aid. So we're curious, and I know this touches on a bit of your work more broadly, what role do you think the international community plays in ensuring that humanitarian aid reaches women and children in conflict settings, and how can we increase it?
Right. I mean, the compounding tragedies here is, the inability of a ceasefire to happen. And that ceasefire is so critical because it's the pathway for humanitarian aid to come through and for international humanitarian actors well established in the international community, meaning that when there is a war and an emergency, they are deployed and they get there. And there are, I understand that humanitarian aid and humanitarian emergencies are just fraught with other kinds of complexities. Now, putting that aside, I do believe 100% that local actors are able to get needs that are being deprived, like basic water, right? Access to water, access to medicine, access to food, that has to come in. And the fact that we've had the United States has blocked is just devastating. It's devastating. And the fact that journalists and humanitarian UN workers have been killed. I don't know, but I did read that the death of humanitarian workers has been quite alarming in the Gaza conflict. And so the international community should be alarmed at that. That means that if humanitarian aid workers are not safe in a place, nobody's safe. And that if humanitarian aid workers cannot move their work forward to helping the most desperate and the most vulnerable, then that is real, a real emergency. And I just feel like, how much more do we have to say about it? At every corner that you go, why are we even having that kind of a conversation, right? Why is a ceasefire so politicized? Why is access to humanitarian aid so complicated? We have the international instruments, we have the resources, we have the money, we have the people. That can happen in a second. It really can. And so to make a claim for it, to now have to rationalize it, pull out, numbers and red flag it, to me is really heartbreaking.
I don't have the data on hand at the moment, which I should have prepared, but I know that humanitarian aid workers are being killed or dying at an increasing rate in conflict zones just around the world. And, that whether or not humanitarian aid is a human right shouldn't be I believe that humanitarian aid shouldn't be politicized in that sense. It should just be a neutral thing that should be provided. Do you think that there's, whether or not it's the Western institutions that are surrounding humanitarian aid and or the, multilateral institutions that like the UN, is there some sort of, I don't know if you've seen this in your research, is there a shift in perspective of these organizations that either their legitimacy or the perspectives of the people on the ground have changed that results in different, like, politicizing them more? Or I don't know if is there a way that you think perspectives have changed of Western institutions that are resulting in this change in humanitarian aid, the politicization of humanitarian aid?
So yeah, that's a very distinct conversation, and there's a lot to say about that. Humanitarian aid has always been politicized. You had, for example, what's called the CNN effect in literature, right? So you have where there is greater media attention, right, all of a sudden that particular conflict or that humanitarian disaster receives an inflow of resources. But there could be the exact same conflict somewhere else that doesn't receive, either it's completely ignored or it, receives a trickle amount. And that kind of and so many who kind of talk about the politics of humanitarian aid look at how humanitarian aid isn't always equal or fair across conflicts or across disasters. And we know that because so much money went into Kosovo, but nothing went to Rwanda during the genocide, until much later. And so that often becomes the case study of comparing the politics of humanitarian aid. But to speak sort of loudly, not loudly, to speak sort of generally about, and loudly, about international organizations generally. So there is the politics of international development organizations or humanitarian organizations or human rights organizations. They have, in different countries, a reputation. And much of how they operate often is related to the kind of, politics that they're part of in the context of that war, that conflict. In Afghanistan, for example, we know for certain that majority of Afghans wanted to keep a distance from international organizations. International organizations and the international community. In Kabul, when I was there, they were often referred to cows that drink their own milk, meaning there was a sense that these organizations were just here for their advancements of their careers. We're just kind of like throwing money here and there willy-nilly. There wasn't sort of well thought out, was a sense they duplicated and replicated work, didn't engage Afghans, or had considered Afghans as just passive recipients instead of active agents in, the recovery of their own society. So that kind of sort of stuck, and we had like a Kabul bubble where you had really like a paradise for international aid workers coming in, staying at the best hotels, having the best salaries, really coming in for a year and then moving on to the next war zone, right? And because it was all about climbing the career ladder, and people notice that. People recognize that this kind of community that's coming in to support us, strengthen us, rebuild us, is actually in it for themselves, perhaps more so than us. And we know that clearly from the Afghanistan papers that were published by the Washington Post, where the United States government officials were actually saying explicitly that, well, we really didn't know what we were doing. We had no stated goals, and we were a self-licking ice cream cone. Meaning money just came in, we had to spend it. We really didn't care about evaluating what we were doing. We were sort of building this, rebuilding that, and there was no accountability. And we know that as a fact by Sigar, the Inspector General for the Reconstruction of Afghanistan, that millions of dollars were wasted. And the end of that is a country doesn't look any different than it did in 2000. 20 years, billions of dollars of aid, so many deaths. And if you go right back to Kabul and you were there at 2000, like maybe better buildings, maybe one or two if they haven't been blown apart. I mean, that that's telling. That's really telling.
I think on this thread of sort of like what you're characterizing as the misdeeds and mistrust of these institutions, and some of your previous work as well in the context of post-coloniality could be an interesting place to go from here. You know, from our view, calls for decolonization include neocolonialism, right? And for me, the actions of these multilateral institutions, whether that be the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, fall under that scope. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what does a better vision for the redistribution of wealth from the global north to the global south look like? And can we talk about that?
Sure. Well, if we go back to Afghanistan, let's establish one very important fact. And this was marked Montgomery and Rodinelli in a published report that came out really early 2003, 2004. They said that the international community arrived in Afghanistan with 50 years of institutional knowledge of how to do peace building and development kind of right. And they applied none of it. So that is, we need to have a conscientious pause. Why foreign aid organizations and actors arrive in a country they know nothing about and start to rebuild it without drawing from 50 years of institutional knowledge in the knowledge banks of these institutions, right? World Bank, US Aid. You know, we have the toolkits, we have the tools. We've been doing this for 50 plus years. And so I'm not saying you're not supposed to make mistakes. Of course you're supposed to make mistakes. But we were making mistakes of lessons that we already learned in other places, that we kept making those mistakes over and over and over again without any accountability or transparency. And so that lackadaisical approach to doing development, just kind of like, oh, let's see. I mean, that is clearly conveyed in the work testimonies US officials. So when that sort of happens, then you have a clear, idea that there is continuity of we would call colonial modalities, which are hierarchical relations of those who know and those who do not know, those who are experts and those who are just beneficiaries and they're passive. And so if foreign aid is built on a hierarchy of us and them, and us are always the ones that know everything, we have all the money, we have the discourse, we have the language, we have the funding, the program plans, and they are merely recognized as empty, passive vessels. And so when you have any aid relationship that is situated in that kind of binary, that is neocolonial. That is clearly a colonial modality. And so if you operate on the basis of relationship where Afghans do not contribute to the thought process, imagining, interpreting, understanding their social, political, economic recoveries for themselves on their land in their country, and foreigners who have no training, who are hopping from conflict to conflict, arrive and have the power to create the pathway of this country's politics, economic, social structure, and then we want to peer into changing culture. That you don't sort of look at it in that framework, and if you don't have an understanding of coloniality as a concept, then you would be wondering, well, this is just the way aid is done. It's not the way aid is done. It's how aid is appropriated within this colonial matrix of power. And it doesn't have to be, because every community that I've worked in the world is open to a collaboration with the international community. It's not that they want to collapse that collaboration, but they are all incredibly weary and suspicious of the kinds of relations that are fostered. And those relations are not equal. And those relations are not liberal. And those relations don't allow for the autonomous sort of intellectual and social political development of societies on their own terms, using their own language, using their own discourses, right? We enter Afghanistan, enter any part of the world, and we roll out the carpet of our discourse. For example, I do gender work. In all of the countries that I work with, there is no equivalent word of gender. Gender isn't in the language in Afghanistan. We have to make it up. In Arab countries, in Urdu, Pakistan, and I was like, okay, let's just use your word. Let's just use your terminology, right? And so if we can conceptualize an idea of a collaboration where it's truly based on solidarity, it's based on equity, and it's based on democratizing, conversations, then the international interventions that are happening in Afghanistan will look very different from Gaza, which will look very different from Somalia, Bosnia, Latin America. But the fact that aid organizations treat all of these countries the exact same way, I can take a program, conceptualize a program, and roll it out in all of these countries without changing anything. That should be problematized. And that is what we call neo.
Thank you so much for that. So we will just conclude now. If there was a book, a paper, or a website that you recommend public policy students can take away, what would you recommend?
All right. So when I was a graduate student at the University of Toronto, I was fortunate because I learned from a number of amazing scholars that were born and raised and had their education outside of the Western world. And Professor George Day had a very strong influence in cultivating my understanding of the need to constantly triangulate, situate, engage, and negotiate my thoughts with scholars from the global south, and to read them because they're rarely published in Western peer-reviewed journals. And so, he made that comment that if you're just reading what Western educated scholars, prioritize, then you're really missing out. And especially if your intent is to understand, what's happening in the world. And so he encouraged us to read the work of scholars based in Africa that were, having a conversation amongst themselves. And many of them are, published in, Western peer-reviewed journals, but many of them are not. And they meet regularly and they publish online, and you kind of get a sense of what conversations or issues are happening on that continent in ways that we sometimes don't have access to. So the website is CODESRIA. It's the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. And I'm looking at the website right now. It is so much better, more accessible, user-friendly than they sort of publish a newsletter called Africa Development. And there's a lot of interesting ideas and positions around women, peace, and security as well. You can really sort of find and engage with these scholars that are writing it.
That's great. We'll be sure to plug that for our listeners. Thank you. And then lastly, to close out, in the spirit of learning from our previous work, what is something that you wish we would have asked you into today's conversation that we didn't?
I think the centrality of ethics, which is something that I am increasingly finding we're not talking about. We're moving towards politicizing and a lot of ideology in our understanding what's happening and what's unfolding in the world. And I really feel that ethics has been lost. And I've lost it myself because I have realized I'm not trained in it. And what I'm positioned into right now is to understand development or politics or war in the context of ethics and morality. And these are conversations that probably now that I'm, attached to the Divinity School, they are circulating more in the Divinity School than they are in public policy. And I think a bridge between those two schools, and where I probably think I too can benefit being, in both schools, is to start to sort of really deeply engage this beyond theory and into sort of an ethical, sort of moral framework of understanding war and peace. And in doing so, I think that maybe I'm going to try and find some answers as to why peace has become so problematic.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict featuring Dr. Maliha Chishti. This episode was produced and edited by Hannah Balikci and Nishita Karun. Thank you to our interviewers, Rabail, Sofi, and Julia Higgins. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of the series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit their website, thepearsoninstitute.org, and follow them on Twitter at PearsonInst, Inst spelled INST.